Hey, I'm Nathan Cole. In this episode, I'm breaking down 5 shocking workplace disasters where cutting corners and pure bad luck collided. From a brutal rubber shredder accident in Vietnam to a freak chainsaw kickback on an Indonesian logging site that turns into pure horror that you won't see coming. It was March 18, 2016, in Binh Duong Province, Vietnam. Heat from the factory roof trapped the smell of burnt rubber across the processing floor, while conveyor belts shook dust loose from the rafters. Workers later said the shredder line sounded rough that morning, louder than usual, but production never slowed down. Nguyen Thanh Lim was 31 years old and worked at a rubber processing plant outside Ho Chi Minh City. His job was feeding reclaimed rubber slabs into an industrial shredder used to recycle old conveyor belts and tire compounds. He lived with his mother, younger sister, and 2 nephews in a rented apartment and had been saving money for a used Honda motorbike. Just for a quick background, the shredder was basically a huge industrial machine designed to chew through old rubber so it could be recycled and reused. Workers stood on a raised platform, feeding heavy rubber slabs into the system using long steel rods, while the machine ran non-stop for most of the shift. It had already been part of the factory's main production line for years, so to the workers there, it was just another normal piece of equipment they dealt with every day. On that morning, Lim's regular partner called in absent. Factory policy required 2 workers at the station, but the supervisor approved a solo operation to avoid slowing production. Around 9:15 a.m., a forklift delivered a heavy reclaimed slab, later identified as old conveyor belt rubber, which was thicker and harder than normal material. Lim pushed the slab into the hopper using the steel rod. The rubber twisted sideways inside the chute and jammed against the rotating shafts. Witness later said Lim was leaning farther over the opening while trying to force the material downward. The machine continued pulling against the jam with enough force to bend steel supports under heavy load. Workers nearby later said they heard a loud metallic snapping sound before the jam suddenly released. The push rod jerked downward violently. Lim still had both hands on the rod when it disappeared into the hopper. The force pulled him forward before he could let go. And I can't even imagine what happened next. A worker saw Lim's upper body pitch over the hopper opening and ran toward the emergency stop while shouting for help. Lim disappeared headfirst into the machine before anyone could reach the controls. Even after the emergency stop was activated, the shredder shafts continued rotating during deceleration. Investigators later explained that the machine simultaneously compressed and sheared the material. Once Liam's head and shoulders entered the cutting discs, there was no chance of survival. The entire thing lasted only seconds, and that's exactly why this story is our case today. For me, this is one of the most brutal factory deaths I've ever researched because by the time crews opened the machine, there was barely anything left to recover. As the machine struggled against the resistance, the overload alarm activated across the processing floor. Emergency crews arrived minutes later and found the shredder jammed with processed rubber granules. Recovery crews spent nearly 2 hours dismantling the housing before removing the remains. Several workers reportedly refused to go near the machine afterward. The post-mortem examination found catastrophic crushing and shearing injuries caused by high-torque industrial machinery. Investigators later used dental fragments and part of a tattoo on the left calf to confirm identification. Labor inspectors later fined the factory for operating dangerous equipment without proper guarding and for allowing solo operation at the shredder station. A steel mesh guard was installed over the hopper opening less than a week later, and production resumed shortly afterward. That shredder accident is horrifying, but what happened next in Jamshedpur takes industrial negligence to an even more terrifying level, moving from a rogue machine to a 40-ton wave of molten steel. It was March 3, 2017, in Jamshedpur, India. Inside a steel factory, the foundry floor was already hot, with furnace heat building inside the casting bay, while fine steel dust settled across the railings, walkways, and control stations. Workers moved between the pouring platforms as production continued through the morning shift. Present that day was Rajan Mishra, 46, one of the most experienced ladle operators in the plant. He had spent 11 years handling molten steel transfers inside the government-contracted foundry after starting there as a floor sweeper in his 20s. And with his experience, you can say he understood the ladle system better than many supervisors. According to the reports I gathered, the foundry was already behind schedule on a railway infrastructure contract that morning. Maintenance reports had flagged a leaking hydraulic seal on the ladle tilt arm almost 2 weeks earlier. Mechanics recommended replacing it during a shutdown period, but production managers delayed repairs to avoid missing shipment quotas tied to financial penalties. The casting floor was also understaffed that morning. 26-year-old Deepak Sharma, a newer worker with limited experience around active pores, had been assigned near the mold guides, while 41-year-old maintenance technician Suresh Patel checked equipment beneath the platform. Investigators later found neither had been warned that a full-capacity transfer was about to begin above them. In a foundry this loud, workers often relied more on routine and timing than direct communication because it was difficult to hear instructions across the bay. The system used hydraulic cylinders to tilt a 40-ton vessel filled with molten steel heated to nearly 1,600 degrees Celsius. Operators controlled the pour from behind reinforced glass because even a small spill could ignite clothing or melt equipment within seconds. Workers nearby later said the heat around active pours felt strong enough to dry your throat almost immediately. The pour started normally at approximately 8:42 a.m. Molten steel flowed cleanly into the receiving mold, while Rajan monitored pressure gauges from the control station. Roughly halfway through the transfer, the hydraulic pressure suddenly dropped. Workers nearby heard a loud cracking sound, followed by a heavy metallic slam from the tilt assembly. Several men reportedly looked up at the same time because that sound did not belong in a normal pour. The hydraulic arm failed almost instantly. Instead of holding position, the 40-ton ladle lurched forward beyond the safe pouring angle. Rajan immediately hit the emergency stop. The vessel's momentum carried molten steel sideways over the mold wall. A wave of burning metal burst across the platform, scattering sparks and slag through the bay. Witnesses later compared it to a wall of bright liquid exploding outward faster than anyone could react. Deepak was standing closest to the mold guide when the spill reached him. Witnesses later said he barely had time to turn toward the noise before molten steel struck his legs and torso. His clothing ignited immediately. Workers later said he collapsed before reaching the nearest ladder. The temperature was intense enough to blister paint off nearby railings within seconds, so you can probably imagine what standing that close did to the human body. Below the platform, Suresh was caught beneath the spill through openings in the steel grating overhead. Molten metal and burning slag rained onto his shoulders, back, and neck while he tried crawling away beneath the machinery. Co-workers dragged him out using welding blankets as emergency alarms echoed across the bay. One worker called emergency services, and plant medics arrived roughly 6 minutes later, carrying oxygen tanks and burn kits. To give you a detail of how bad the accident was, several workers reportedly ran outside vomiting, while others had to cover their faces with their shirts just to get close enough to pull him out. Deepak died at the scene before paramedics arrived. Suresh was transported to a hospital with severe burns across most of his upper body. Doctors placed him on ventilation and treated him for shock, but the damage was too extensive. He died roughly 2 hours later after multiple organs failed from heat trauma and blood loss. The post-mortem examination found that Deepak suffered immediate fatal destruction to the lungs, airway, and internal organs caused by direct contact with molten steel. Suresh's report documented 3rd and 4th degree burns across nearly 70% of his body, along with severe inhalation injuries. The Labor Department temporarily suspended foundry operations and cited the company for delaying hydraulic repairs and failing to clear workers from the hazard zone. Rajan later told investigators the hydraulic issues had been reported multiple times before the accident, but repairs were repeatedly postponed to keep production running. Limited operations later resumed in unaffected sections of the facility after emergency repairs and initial inspections, while the damaged production area remained closed during the continuing investigation. That foundry disaster always makes my blood boil, and I see that exact same deadly gamble mirrored out at sea, where a split-second winch mistake cost a fisherman his life. It was August 14, 2017 in the South China Sea, about 30 nautical miles west of Sarangani province. The sea stayed unusually calm through the night, while diesel fumes and rotting bait hung over the deck of the Maricel MB. Crewmen later said the calm weather made everyone less alert during the early morning haul. Ferdinand "Ferdy" Laxa was 34 years old and one of the more experienced crewmen aboard the Maricel MB. He started commercial fishing at 16 after leaving school in General Santos City to help support his family. Over the years, he learned the rules fishermen depended on to survive: never stand inside loose-line coils, never trust a wet deck, and never put a hand near an active hauler. The Maricel MB used a hydraulic line hauler to pull thousands of baited hooks from the water under extreme tension. And honestly, once something gets caught in those rollers, the machine can pull a person in faster than anyone nearby can react. That trip had already gone longer than planned because the captain was trying to fill the freezing hold before the ice supply spoiled. The crew had been hauling lines for nearly 14 hours with little rest. Several men later admitted they had slept less than 3 hours total since leaving port 2 days earlier. The deckhand assigned to monitor the safety lock had reportedly been struggling to stay awake since sunrise. And for me, that part really matters, because once crews get exhausted out there, small mistakes stop getting noticed until something goes seriously wrong. At about 7:22 a.m., a yellowfin tuna weighing more than 180 pounds surfaced beside the vessel, tangled deep inside several branch lines near the hydraulic hauler. The fish twisted violently against the gear, causing loops of line to jam inside the rollers. Clearing tangles by hand was dangerous, but still common on older fishing boats, because shutting the entire system down slowed production. Ferdy stepped beside the hauler, wearing rubber boots and cut-resistant gloves soaked with seawater and fish blood. Witnesses later told Coast Guard investigators he leaned toward the tangled line while calling for the safety lock to be engaged. The deckhand responsible for the lock had drifted asleep near the rail. The hydraulic hauler suddenly regained tension. Crewmen later said the sound changed first, from a slow, grinding pull into a sharp, metallic whine as the line tightened. Ferdy's right sleeve caught inside the spinning rollers before he could pull free. The machine yanked his upper body sideways into the housing. The line tension tore his right arm completely off at the shoulder almost instantly. Several crewmen nearby were sprayed with blood as the severed arm disappeared overboard, still attached to the fishing line. And from what I researched, this is exactly why fishermen stay away from active haulers. Because once the rollers grab part of your body, there's almost no time for anyone nearby to stop it. Ferdy collapsed backward onto the deck while blood pumped heavily from the exposed shoulder cavity. One fisherman tied a bait rag around the wound as a tourniquet, while another used canvas tarps to keep him from sliding across the wet deck. The captain radioed maritime emergency responders, requesting medical evacuation. The nearest rescue helicopter was unavailable, forcing another aircraft to be dispatched from farther along the coast. Crewmen later estimated it arrived nearly 4 hours later after repeated updates reporting severe blood loss and worsening condition. And this is the brutal part about accidents at sea. Even when everybody does the right thing afterward, help can still be hours away. By then, Ferdy had turned pale gray and was barely breathing. He stopped responding and died 20 minutes before the helicopter arrived. The post-mortem examination determined the cause of death was catastrophic blood loss caused by complete traumatic amputation of the right arm at the shoulder. The hydraulic rollers destroyed major blood vessels and tore muscle away from the chest wall. The Maritime Industry Authority later cited the vessel for safety violations involving fatigue management and improper lockout procedures during hauling operations. Investigators concluded the machine should have been fully disengaged before any manual clearing work began. Ferdy's family received compensation equal to about 2 months of wages and signed a settlement agreement without legal assistance. Losing a limb at sea is horrifying, but what happened next proves deadly workplace accidents don't always come from massive machines or heavy equipment. Sometimes, all it takes is one hidden object in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tragedies like these prove safety can never take a back seat. If you want more uncovered industrial history, consider subscribing to watch more brutal workplace accidents. It was June 23, 2014, at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Rain earlier that week left the drainage roads soft and uneven, while heavy humidity settled over the concrete runoff channels beside the service route. Grass along the ditch had grown nearly knee-high after repeated weather delays, covering debris and broken concrete hidden beneath the overgrowth. Near the drainage corridor, 44-year-old Darnell Obi Purvis was working a maintenance shift for a landscaping contractor assigned to the military base. He had spent years bouncing between warehouse jobs, roofing work, and temporary labor around Fayetteville before finally finding steady groundswork with reliable pay and benefits. Darnell lived alone outside the base and rarely missed shifts. Co-workers described him as quiet and dependable, the kind of worker supervisors trusted with difficult assignments because he usually handled them without complaining. And that probably explains why he ended up working alone after another crew member called out sick. The area had not been serviced for nearly 2 weeks because of rain delays. Tall grass covered sections of eroded concrete lining the ditch, while loose gravel, rusted bolts, and damaged construction hardware had gradually collected near the runoff channels over time. Darnell was operating a commercial walk-behind mower with heavy steel blades spinning at thousands of RPMs beneath the deck. Workers later told investigators the terrain was difficult to inspect properly because thick vegetation hid most of the ground from view. Around 9:55 a.m., Darnell pushed the mower along the edge of the drainage corridor while working alone after another crew member called out sick. Wet grass jammed heavily beneath the deck as the mower cut through overgrowth nearly 10 inches high. And that's actually scary for me, because once the grass gets thick enough to hide the ground completely, operators are basically blind to what is waiting underneath. Seconds later, the mower rolled over a partially exposed steel anchor plate hidden beneath the grass near the concrete edge. Investigators later determined the spinning blade struck the metal hard enough to fracture part of the mower blade itself. Witnesses nearby described hearing a loud metallic snap, followed almost instantly by debris striking the concrete drainage wall beside the route. One jagged steel fragment blasted backward through the mower's discharge opening and shattered Darnell's safety glasses before striking the area around his right eye. And a second fragment tore into the left side of his neck beneath the jawline. The impact knocked him backward onto the wet concrete beside the ditch while the mower continued running near the edge of the drainage channel. Witnesses later said blood sprayed across the mower handles and the concrete wall within seconds. And this is the terrifying part of this story. The moment those blades hit hidden metal, the mower basically fires razor-sharp shrapnel back toward the operator at extreme speed. A nearby grounds worker ran toward Darnell and found him on his back, trying to hold the side of his neck shut with both hands. Blood was pouring through his fingers and draining into the runoff channel beneath him. Witnesses later said the damage around his right eye was already catastrophic from the fragment impact. Emergency services were called immediately, but the isolated drainage access road delayed crews reaching the scene. By the time paramedics arrived, Darnell had already lost a massive amount of blood and was drifting in and out of consciousness. Doctors later found the metal fragment had severed major blood vessels in Darnell's neck. Surgeons attempted emergency repairs, but the blood loss was too severe, and he died less than 3 hours later. Investigators later recovered shattered mower blade sections, rusted construction debris, and the buried steel anchor plate hidden beneath the grass. The mower was also missing a rear debris flap designed to reduce projectile discharge. Darnell's family later received workers' compensation benefits through the contractor's insurance provider, though co-workers reportedly said the payout barely covered funeral expenses and remaining medical bills tied to the emergency treatment. No criminal charges were filed, but the company was required to update mowing procedures around drainage corridors and issue additional protective equipment for operators working in heavy vegetation. Several workers later refused to cut overgrown roots unless the ground was inspected manually beforehand. But after seeing what happened to Darnell, it's hard to blame them. That mowing accident shows how dangerous hidden hazards can be on the ground. But in our final case, a logger in Indonesia faced the same kind of hidden danger buried deep inside a tree trunk. It was August 14, 2017 at a logging site outside Medan, North Sumatra, Indonesia. Overnight rain left the ground wet and unstable, while fresh-cut acacia covered the clearing with sawdust and damp wood chips. Workers later said the trees felt unusually heavy that morning, enough to strain chainsaw engines during long cuts. Artie Santoso was 38 years old and had worked logging jobs across North Sumatra for nearly 2 decades. He cleared farmland and secondary forest for small contractors paid by the hectare. Coworkers trusted him because he understood how trees shifted during cuts and rarely made mistakes handling difficult trunks. What surprised me while researching this is how much experience chainsaw work actually takes. A logger isn't just cutting wood. They're constantly trying to predict how the tree will react once the blade goes in. Artie used a gasoline chainsaw with a 20-inch guide bar, but safety gear on rural logging sites was limited. He wore gloves and rubber boots that day, but had no face shield or neck protection. And after years of doing the same work, a lot of loggers stop thinking about missing gear unless something has already gone wrong. His wife, Sari, had recently given birth to their third child, so Artie had been accepting every extra job he could get to help pay the hospital bills. And like a lot of fathers in situations like this, he saw the extra work as a blessing. Around 11:20 a.m., Artie was cutting through a large acacia trunk that had already been felled earlier that morning. His partner, Denny, walked back toward the truck to refill fuel and grab drinking water. Artie stayed behind to finish one final cut before lunch, while the chainsaw echoed through the clearing in short bursts. And I can't believe how unlucky that decision is. Because if he only take a lunch first, maybe the outcome would be different. Artie was cutting through the acacia trunk at full throttle when the chainsaw suddenly struck something solid buried inside the wood. Investigators later discovered it was a rusted iron boundary spike hidden beneath years of tree growth. The impact caused the saw to kick violently sideways toward his body. The chain tore through Artie's left forearm before striking the right side of his neck and lower jaw. The injury happened in less than a second, which really shows how unforgiving chainsaw kickbacks are once the blade loses control. Blood sprayed across the trunk and nearby grass while the chainsaw dropped beside him, still running. Investigators later believed he remained standing briefly before collapsing against a smaller tree nearby. And for me, this is the hardest part of this story. Knowing he was still alive for several minutes after the kickback, fully aware of how badly he had been injured. When Denny returned about 4 minutes later, after noticing the chainsaw had gone silent, he found Artie sitting against the trunk with one hand pressed against his neck, while blood soaked through his shirt and gloves. Denny called a nearby village health worker and tried wrapping a towel around the wound, but Artie lost consciousness before help arrived. Because the logging site was deep in the hills, the health worker and 2 responders did not reach the area for another 18 minutes by motorcycle. By then, severe blood loss had already caused cardiac arrest. Responders attempted CPR, but Artie was pronounced dead before transport to the provincial hospital. The post-mortem examination found fatal neck trauma and massive blood loss caused by the chainsaw kickback. Doctors reported the main artery on the right side of Artie's neck had been nearly severed, while cuts on his left forearm suggested he instinctively tried blocking the blade. Investigators later recovered a heavily rusted iron boundary spike buried inside the acacia trunk beneath years of growth. Officials stated that older roadside trees in the region often contained hidden nails, wire, and metal debris, but smaller logging crews rarely had access to detection equipment. Workers later admitted they usually relied on experience alone when cutting older trees because scanning tools were too expensive for small operations. And for me, this is what makes logging work so dangerous, because sometimes the thing that kills you is buried deep inside the tree long before the chainsaw ever touches it.